Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Jones, and today Emily Robinson, Allison Voss, and Melinda Thacker and I will be discussing our clinical question, which involves self-awareness in children with Down syndrome who stutter. So our question is, in children with Down syndrome who stutter, what is the effect of self-awareness on self-esteem and communication participation? Next slide. Our question is more qualitative in nature, so the elements of our PICO question are loosely defined. Our population is children with Down syndrome who stutter, and we wanted to examine how self-awareness in this population impacts self-esteem and communicative participation. So those fit into our intervention and outcome sections. And because this is a qualitative question, we did not look at a specific comparison.
So our clinical case is based off of a client that I had this last semester. He's a 10-year, 4-month child named Henry, and his name and age are changed for HIPAA purposes. He has Down syndrome. He's from a large, supportive family, and he's super positive, happy, and sociable. And he's also literate, which is somewhat notable for a child with Down syndrome since they struggle more with that. While we were doing a language assessment, we noticed some stuttering, so we decided to do a stuttering assessment. Next slide, Melinda. And in terms of the stuttering, we did the Stuttering Severity Index, the 4th edition, and we found that Henry stutters in about 24% of his syllables in conversation and 10% of syllables in written passages. So that ends up being below the first percentile in the severity rating. And it's also below the first percentile for his severe physical concomitants, which are things that go along with the stuttering. They're behaviors that go along with it, like your trunk jerk, your rocking, moving your head from side to side, grimacing, blinking, talking louder, and also physical tensing. Some mild speech sound errors were also noted in his speech. However, when he repeated the words, it didn't really affect his intelligibility, and you could understand what he was saying. So really it is that severity of stuttering element that was impacting his intelligibility. You could understand the gist of what he was saying, but rarely could I ever understand all of the details. So I rated his intelligibility at approximately 70 to 80%, which really did affect him quite a bit. Next slide. His family had previously been told to ignore the stuttering so that it didn't hurt his self-esteem or make him less sociable. We mentioned how Henry is a little bit older, he's 10 years old, and it's super noticeable now that his stuttering is impacting his intelligibility and for his options for social play, making friends, talking to people. And he notices to a small extent that he does have bumpy speech. Due to these factors, we did decide to target stuttering in therapy. But the trouble was getting Henry to realize why stuttering was a problem. He dislikes being interrupted, he still has friends, and so we wanted him to see the point of stuttering therapy for it to increase his intelligibility without him disliking speech and interaction.
Okay, this is Sarah, and I will be giving some relevant background information for this population. First, looking at prevalence, it's estimated that there are about 8.27 people in 10,000 who have Down syndrome. And within this population, it has been found that 10 to 45% present with dysfluency. And that's such a wide range just because dysfluency is a pretty broad term that encompasses a lot of things. But even still, comparing that to prevalence in typically developing population, which is 1% people who have dysfluency problems, it really is a pretty common thing for people with Down syndrome to have dysfluency problems. Next slide. And here I've listed some other general characteristics of individuals with Down syndrome that are relevant to our question. For example, their language production tends to lag behind cognition. There's a high prevalence of hearing loss. They are passive learners. They avoid new learning and change, and they have relatively immature self-awareness. And all these factors can contribute to speech perception and production issues, and that has implications for intervention, including stuttering intervention. Finally, it's important to consider that there is a high variability in abilities and personalities within this population, so personal factors must always be taken into account.
This is Ali again. We wanted to see the relationship of self-awareness and what it had on stuttering to inform our thoughts and opinions on my clinical case. Self-awareness is a factor in communication, perception, and participation, meaning that the awareness that we have of ourselves and our speech informs how we view conversations and social interactions with those around us. And it has a large effect on our communication in general, along with our thoughts on speech events that might be negative, like stuttering or misspeaking in conversation. Some approaches already recognize this, like stuttering modification. So stuttering modification was described in detail by Van Wipper, who said that it's an approach to help people increase their awareness of their stuttered speech, reduce their physical tension, and then to change and replace the moments of stuttering to be more relaxed. Next slide. Self-awareness is important to consider in this case because there's already a documented negative relationship between IQ and self-esteem for populations with learning disabilities. So this essentially means that the higher your IQ is, the lower your self-esteem. In other words, children on the high functioning end of Down syndrome, similar to my client, and Down syndrome is a learning disability due to cognitive deficits, and children with other learning disabilities who are more self-aware will typically present with that lower self-esteem. And that's something that we don't want them to have because we want them to be able to be confident in themselves. So when thinking about this, it's super critical to remember that self-awareness is really more of a continuum. It's not just there or not there, but it's there in varying degrees. So we just want to remember that for our Down syndrome populations.
All right, this is Melinda. So for the outcome piece of our PICO question background, we talked about two pieces. One was self-esteem. And the first part of this is that mental illness is common in people with learning disabilities, we know, including those with Down syndrome, and this may be related to low self-esteem due to communication difficulties. Emotional and social health are also affected by self-esteem. And we know that bullying incidence is increased in teens who stutter. And second part of this is communication participation. And so avoidance of social interaction is a possibility for those who have learning disabilities and struggle with communication, which could lead to more mental illness. A study by Erickson and Block that studied 36 teens who stutter, but who were typically developing otherwise, showed that they had low self-perception of communicative competence, had high apprehension for public speaking, but that they stated that stuttering made little difference in their social lives. This is an interesting profile that we wanted to see if it applied to Down syndrome as well. We wanted to look also at friendships, vocational pursuits, and independence as far as communication participation.
So I'm sort of going to recap how this applies to Henry and our PICO question. So Henry is moderately high functioning with Down syndrome. He can read, his intelligibility is pretty high, and he has success interacting with others. But he does experience some frustration in communication encounters when others are recognize his stuttering and when he has to re-speak. Specifically pertaining to the stuttering as well, he realizes that he has the pumpy speech, but he doesn't really understand how it affects the people he's talking to. Therefore, we think that stuttering might be good to implement, but it might not be too. In therapy, I don't want to be implementing an approach that could hurt Henry's self-esteem, so we're asking a question to determine whether the stuttering intervention could potentially be beneficial for Henry due to his current and potential future levels of self-awareness. Next slide. Stuttering was targeted this semester in therapy, and he began with about 24% conversational stuttering, so that's 76% fluency, but we managed to decrease that down to 11% stuttering or 89% fluency by using different stuttering modification and fluency shaping techniques. These include identification, noticing those moments of stuttering, cancellation, repeating the stuttered word when you say like caramel to caramel. And then you just replace that word to cancel it out. Easy onsets, which is just going into the word with good breath support and a light touch. And then connecting words together so that speech sounds way more fluent. And the next slide. After one semester of therapy, like we said, he was able to decrease that a significant amount. However, in terms of his self-awareness and self-esteem, he has seemed slightly less excited to participate in speech therapy. And his mom has mentioned that he doesn't enjoy it as much either. And then also he rolls his eyes and he feels as though I don't listen to him, he says, when he's telling an entire story, when I try to stop that and go back and do the stuttering therapy techniques.
Hi, this is Emily, and I'll be starting us off with some research evidence about our question. First, we wanted to evaluate research on the effects of self-awareness and self-esteem and communication participation in typically developing individuals. Although the population in our question is specifically involving individuals with intellectual disabilities, this systematic review by Connery et al. In 2019 still answers our question because it analyzes the lived experiences of people who stutter. All right, next slide, please. So the purpose of this study was to integrate qualitative findings on the lived experiences of people who stutter and identify implications for rehabilitation. The rationale for this study that Connery and her colleagues came up with was that, stuttering impacts many different parts of an individual's life. It affects their mental health, their job opportunities, job performance, and financial status. Therefore, stuttering can increase an individual's risk of having negative life experiences and reduce their overall life satisfaction. This study was found to be a level 5 in terms of evidence because it's a systematic review of qualitative studies. So it's not quite as strong as one that would be, is what a systematic review of quantitative studies would be. All right, next slide. All right, so the design of this study was a synthesis of qualitative studies that explored the experiences of stuttering from the perspective of adults who stutter using meta-ethnography. Inclusion criteria for all of the different studies included they all had to have be all adult participants. They all had to be published between the years of 2000 and 2018. They all had to have qualitative methods of collecting and analyzing data. They had to be in the English language, contain keywords like qualitative, adult, and stuttering, and individual experiences needed to be able to be extracted separately rather than just summarizing an entire group of people who stutter as a whole. They wanted to be able to pull out individual experiences. All right, next slide. So the total studies that were evaluated were 2,244 studies. And out of those, only 17 fit all those inclusion criteria and they were used. And studies from all the studies were from 5 different countries that you can look at on the slide. All right, so some information that was analyzed from each study was they looked at the country, the participant descriptions, the design, the data analysis, the primary focus, their recruitment methods, and their data collection. They also did a quality appraisal in this study by using the Critical Appraisal Skills Program. And this uses 10 questions to determine quality of the study. And you can look into Connery et al.'s full article if you're interested in those 10 questions. When initially reading each study, the authors in Connery pinpointed participant quotes and each study's interpretation of those quotes. And while translating the studies, the authors identified key concepts of each study, and then they looked at each one to determine if the same key concept was present in each one. And this really helped the authors identify themes across all of the studies. So the 5 different themes that came out of this systematic review were, number 1, avoidance is used to manage stuttering. And so that means that people may not even feel comfortable to introduce themselves. And the second theme they found is that stuttering unfavorably impacts employment experiences. So employers sometimes do not choose to hire people because of their disfluencies. The third theme is the one that we thought was most important to our question, and that is that stuttering shapes self-identity. And I'll go a little bit more into that later. The fourth theme was that stuttering leads to negative reactions in people. They can often feel fear, shyness, and confusion when talking with people that stutter if they aren't familiar with the population. And the fifth theme was that stuttering impacts relationships adversely. So like I mentioned before, they have a really hard time communicating with others. People feel fear, shyness, and confusion. And also their parents oftentimes feel really bad. All right, now that we have mentioned all these 5 themes, let's dive a little bit more into that third theme of shaping self-identity. So there are some positives that were found with people that stutter in regard to their self-identity. Some positives were if people can realize that their purpose in life is greater than being a stutterer, then they have a greater and more positive outlook on themselves and on life. They also feel more included and they have more achievement and support in their environment when they can do that. There were a lot of negative things as well that impacted self-identity. That involved stuttering. And one of those that was really big was that negative self-esteem was reinforced over time. So as these people stuttered more and more, they began to have this self-esteem that was really negative, and it just continued to be reinforced over time. People in the studies also used words to describe themselves like hated, despised, different, and stupid, which is a shame. And one quote that really stood out to me was an individual said, "I think I probably would have been more outgoing, more talkative, and participated a lot more. I think my life would have been different if I hadn't stuttered." And that's really heart-wrenching to see that stuttering really does shape our self-identity and our self-esteem. So Connery said that after all of this research, we need to note that we should treat individuals that stutter and create goals for them that focus on their life experiences and their mental health. So although the systematic review didn't highlight our specific population, it did focus on treatment as well as individuals' perceptions about their stuttering. The systematic review was useful in helping us gain a greater understanding of individuals' perceptions of stuttering before treatment, or when treatment did not include goals involving mental health, self-advocacy, or support within their environment. All right, so let's talk about how this applies to Henry. So this study did apply to adults. However, Henry will be an adult one day. And so this kind of shows us what could possibly happen with Henry in the future. Henry may have an increase in his self-awareness as he gets older, which may cause him to avoid social situations, interact with others, may impact his ability to make friends, and really may negatively shape his self-identity. So as Henry's clinician, it's so important to consider these factors that could have really big implications on his future.
Okay, this is Sarah, and we will be looking at the next piece of piece of evidence that we looked at, which was a study conducted by Monica Bray in 2015, entitled, "Is Stuttering Therapy Useful for Adolescents and Adults with Down Syndrome Who Are Disfluent?" So we'll be diving a little bit deeper into our question here. Next slide. This was a qualitative study that used grounded theory to examine what adolescents and adults with Down syndrome might need from speech and language treatment, with a specific focus on stuttering treatment. The participants for the study were 14 adolescents and adults with Down syndrome between the ages of 12 and 32. While this population is older than our client, as Emily said, we're not just concerned about him right now, but also in the future and how stuttering might affect him later on. In addition, because there is such a wide range of abilities in Down syndrome, this age group may be more representative than it appears. This was a qualitative, uncontrolled, non-interventional study, which indicated a weak level of evidence. However, the study was still systematic and provides a good quality of evidence. Next slide. To gather information for this question that Bray had, she used action-based methods like ordering and grouping pictures and activities like that to explore self-awareness and self-esteem of the participants. She conducted interviews with the participants to examine their feelings about speech and stuttering, and she also organized focus groups and interviews with parents to discuss communication needs, personality awareness, and self-esteem of their children. Next slide. The games and activities were coded for ease of completion, understanding of the task, and appropriateness of choices, while the interviews were coded for level of speech and stuttering awareness, self-esteem, and feelings about communication. And some themes emerged through this process: personality, feelings of about communication, and fluency, and these will be discussed later. So the games and activities revealed that the participants saw themselves as being the best at things like their favorite activities, talking, and having friends, showing a lot of high self-esteem. And also she found that only 5 could self-identify as having Down syndrome, which has implications about self-awareness. And some tasks ended up being a little bit more difficult for these participants because of metalinguistic components in the tasks. Next slide. The first theme that emerged was personality, and the young people's feelings about their own personality were unanimously positive. They used words like happy, making people laugh, gorgeous, beautiful lady to describe themselves. And parents' comments on their children's personalities were also predominantly positive. They described their children with words like generally cheerful individual, has lots of confidence, bubbly and friendly and happy. Some parents also reported moodiness, especially in response to being asked to do something. But overall, it's clear that the personality of these individuals are very positive. Next slide. Next, she discussed, Bray found feelings about talking and discussed this. In general, the young people expressed positive feelings about talking in comfortable situations like talking to friends and relatives, family, their moms especially, while they had more negative feelings towards uncomfortable or frustrating situations where they didn't feel understood. And parents affirmed that these young people are highly aware when communication is difficult, and that often leads to anger and avoidance. Next slide. The final theme was related to fluency. Of the 14 participants, 6 were judged to be disfluent. In talking to the young people, 2 out of 6 of them were aware of their stuttering, and the other 4 were not. 3 out of 6 of the parents saw stuttering as an additional, pretty significant problem in their children. In general, stuttering was considered to decrease intelligibility, and 2 out of 6 parents said stuttering led to avoidance in certain situations. Next slide. So Bray first asked this question: is stuttering therapy useful given the level of self-awareness and social awareness in this population? Like Ali described earlier, many of the stuttering approaches address directly negative feelings about communication. And for this population, communication breakdowns, while they often do lead to frustration because they don't feel like they're being heard, they often don't lead to shame. And in fact, often these children, these individuals, see the breakdown as being more caused by the listener than they themselves. They say that they have difficulty talking to other people because they don't really listen to me. So overall, she found that self-esteem and positive feelings towards talking are maintained in this population. Next slide. Then she looked at whether stuttering therapy is useful given the learning and cognitive abilities of this population. Normally they are passive learners, and introducing therapy that introduces external reinforcement may reduce generalization. Self-monitoring is complex and requires awareness of one's own speech. And the inability to do this in this population, because it's really hard for them, may lead to feelings of shame, which we never want to encourage or develop in these individuals. And she also posited that deficits in attention, memory, and problem solving could limit the effectiveness of some of the more traditional stuttering approaches. So Bray concluded that although looking at stuttering treatment for this population can be a challenge, that doesn't mean that it can't be useful. Rather, she suggested that positive features of Down syndrome can be used to adapt treatment to meet the needs of this population. These individuals love to talk. They have high self-esteem. Friendships and relationships are important to them. They learn really well when they have salient information, personally relevant information. And she also found, interestingly, that many already use a lot of coping strategies when they don't feel understood. They'll slow down, they'll choose a new word, use body movements to support speech flow, or they'll ask for someone else to talk for them. And while some of these are more positive coping strategies than others, they're all things that we can build on. Next slide. So Bray gave several ideas for possible ways to incorporate these factors in individuals with Down syndrome as we look at treatment in the future. We can do more conversation partner training, like is done in dysarthria. Reducing linguistic demands might also be helpful. Having more client-led activities that focus on things that are positive and fulfilling for the client. And also building on the behavioral repertoire of the individual, so we can enhance and modify the strategies that they're already using to help them achieve these goals. So now looking at Henry, he possesses many of these positive features that have been discussed. He has a positive attitude, high self-esteem, he values friendships, and has lots of friends. Some other things to consider: he is just learning to be aware of his bumpy speech. So he's just beginning to have some of that self-awareness. And stuttering already does have a small impact on his social life and self-perception. So looking at Henry, we feel that intervention would be most effective if we take those positive things that he has and take his behaviors that he already has and modify treatment to include meaningful activities to facilitate change in him while maintaining his positive self-esteem.
All right, this is Melinda. I'm talking about the last primary source. This is by Jackson et al. And so the purpose of this design was to explore a relationship between communication difficulties and self-esteem for adults with Down syndrome and to include them in research. And this was because self-awareness, social comparison, and stigma aspects of self-esteem had been looked at, but communication had not. And because this population had really not been included in the research and the perspective was missing. So it's a grounded theory, qualitative research. 12 adult participants with Down syndrome were used in this study, and additionally, 12 adults that they nominated, someone who knew them well. They nominated their mothers in every case. So the procedure, they interviewed the participants with Down syndrome to ask how they communicated and with who and how they described themselves. The nominees were given similar interviews but answered the questions about the Down syndrome participants. The interviews were recorded, transcribed, and coded for themes, and they reported measures for reliability. 7 main themes were found, including disability and difference, exposure, independence, identity, communication difficulties, communication modifications, and resources and strengths. These findings are a combination of pieces from those themes. So the Down syndrome participants did not want to be grouped with other disabilities, and they stated that they think that having a disability is negative, and this just shows self-awareness of their disability. New situations led to difficulty communicating, which led to withdrawal, according to the nominees, which affected self-esteem, and they showed increased self-esteem from living independently. I like this quote because it has an incidence of stuttering in it. I catch the bus on my own now, but it showed that having that outside factor of living independently was really more important in this case, even though they still stuttered. And when they compared themselves to people without disabilities, this had negatively affected their self-esteem, and difficulty keeping conversations going because of communication difficulties increased loneliness. So communication difficulties theme really answered our question the most. So awareness of communication difficulties was high, and many Down syndrome participants had a stutter and indicated that they disliked it. So they really were aware of their difficulties. And low confidence led to increased awareness of communication difficulties. Speech fluency was positively correlated with mood. So as their mood went up, their fluencies also were more fluent. And if they had a low mood, they had more disfluencies. And then if Down syndrome participants sense that they lack skills or not be able to cope, they withdrew. So this also indicates effect on self-esteem. So the main conclusions from this article were that decreased confidence in communication led to increased perception of stigma. So they became more aware of their difficulties as they became less confident. So confidence is an important thing to consider when treating. Communicative difficulties affected low self-esteem, which affected communicative difficulties as a cycle. And mood and speech fluency showed a similar relationship. So the quality of this study, some positive things were that they reported efforts to code reliably. They had explicit procedures and ample evidence in quotes. Negative things are that the samples had a small sample size and there was no member check, which would have helped us understand if we really understood the experience of those with Down syndrome. This is a weak level of evidence due to being an uncontrolled, non-interventional study, qualitative study. Clinical application, it really is just that this population, though older than our client, forecast the future of our client, as has been said before. And it was very valid because of how it showed how they were affected socially, mentally, and even vocationally. So some reasons to treat stuttering from this article are that an increased ability to hold conversations, increased ability to maintain friendships, and it increases intelligibility to be able to allow them to live on their own, and increases their perception of communication skills to lead to less withdrawal. Something that was interesting, though, was that treating stuttering might also increase their negative perception of themselves, which might lead to withdrawal. So some suggestions from Jackson et al. They suggested that teaching social skills would prevent some of these bad things and help these clients really have a positive outcome. All right, so Henry, we suggest intervening with his stuttering in order to increase his intelligibility and allow for his independence later on, and to teach social communication skills in order to prevent a decrease in social interaction, to provide counseling that addresses self-esteem in order to help maintain his high level of self-esteem. And let's see, that was it for that.
All right, so let's talk about our evidence-based practice decision and the data that supported it. Go ahead to the next slide. So our question, just to remind you, we've gone through so much information. So just to remind you, our question was, in children with Down syndrome who stutter, what is the effect of self-awareness on self-esteem and communication participation? Through our research, we found negative correlation between self-esteem and self-awareness. So as they became more aware of their stuttering, their self-esteem decreased. We also found a negative correlation between self-awareness and how they feel about their stuttering. If the client is not aware of their dysfluencies, they feel more positively about themselves. We also found that as children get older, they often become more self-aware, and this self-awareness may change due to the client's level of functioning. So it's important to be aware of their level of functioning there. Due to our client's age and diagnosis of Down syndrome, he does not really recognize why his stuttering is a problem, and he doesn't have a strong awareness of his stuttering. As he becomes older, he may become more aware of this stuttering and demonstrate avoidance behaviors as a way to deal with it, which is what we don't want. So let's talk a little bit about how we came to our conclusion. To begin with, we know that as children become more aware of their stuttering, their self-esteem will often decrease, which leads to negative experiences. We also know that depending on their past experiences and level of functioning, individuals with Down syndrome may or may not be aware of their stuttering, and we know that treatment for stuttering has been found to be effective at decreasing the fluency of, or at increasing fluency. We also took the client's family values into account as we went through all of this, and the family has previously been told to ignore the stuttering, but is now unsure if they should begin to address it as Henry's getting older or not. So it was important for them to weigh the pros and cons of treatment before making a decision. We also really tried to take the client's contextual factors into account when coming up with our answer. Our client presents with Down syndrome and is high functioning. It is also important to note that he's 10 years old, and all of these contextual factors were taken into consideration when we came to our conclusions. So there are some changes that are needed in typical practice and modifications that need to happen because he has Down syndrome. Some literature suggests that when an individual becomes more aware, they can decrease their self-esteem. So clinicians to be aware of this as they treat individuals for their dysfluencies. When treating individuals with Down syndrome, there's some helpful suggestions that Sarah mentioned, so please feel free to go back into the PowerPoint and listen to those. Some of them are listed on this slide too. It's also important to teach social communication because it is a preventative for mental health issues and mental illness. But no matter who your client is or what condition they have, it's important to recognize that treatment should be individualized for each client, especially for their level of functioning and level of motivation.
So finally, for measuring the data to test this EBP decision, what are some ways that we can really measure this in Henry? And so some ideas that we had is measuring positive feelings versus negative feelings about Bumpy's speech by having him sort pictures into how he feels. Like, does he feel happy about Bumpy's speech, using smiley faces, frowny faces, things like that. We can also use parent questionnaires, teacher and recess aid questionnaires to make sure he's not withdrawing, to make sure that he's doing well, and that his socialization hasn't decreased. Thank you all so much for listening to our presentation. It was super informative and helpful for all of us as clinicians, and we wish you all very happy holidays and a very Merry Christmas break.